Good evening, Racket Athlete podcast fans. We're here for another episode with the Racket Athlete podcast. First of all, I'd like to just mention my sponsor and podcast sponsor is Tayside Stringing Services, which is a racket restringing company which look at squash rackets, badminton rackets, and tennis rackets or restrings. They have a website. You just type in Google Tayside Stringing Services, or they have Facebook or Instagram. So if you're looking for something quality stringing, please go ahead and look them up and follow them. Tonight we have on Carl Bescoby PHD, Mr. Injury Psychology. So how would you like to introduce yourself, Carl? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. I think you did a pretty good job there. But good evening and hello. I'm a psychologist. Go by the name of the injury psychologist on social media and my website. But essentially, I'm a psychologist. My training and background has been in sport primarily, and also in kind of chronic illness and injury. So I kind of mix the two up and kind of work at the intersection of between injury, health, well-being, and performance, and work with a lot of injured athletes through the rehabilitation process from the psychological side. So yeah, going to talk a little bit about that today.
Nice. That's a good introduction from yourself there. Thank you for that, Carol. So first of all, how can we just go about giving the viewers, listeners, some insight onto what injury psychology, kind of what bracket it is and how it works for yourself and the athletes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the way in which I guess we can look at this is first and foremost, the link between psychology and injury is profound, but also quite complex. When we go through an experience, an injury, it involves a lot of emotional responses. It involves managing and addressing not only the physical component, the physical side, but the psychological side. Now, within that, there are emotions, there are responses to injury which happen. And the interplay between the emotions and our psychological response can be quite an upheaval for individuals. So I guess injury psychology is all about how to manage and navigate the emotional side and the psychological side of injury and rehabilitation. So when we go through an injury, it's a hard stop. It's an unexpected, sometimes really disruptive thing that happens in our lives, and we've got to find ways in which we can navigate that. So injury psychology helps support that process and offer tools to encourage people to find the growth and the opportunity in some of those setbacks.
Yeah, so yeah, that's quite a simple but slightly complex sort of way of putting it, shall we say, but it was very understandable. Thank you for that. But yeah, so kind of like mixing it up with emotional well-being and dealing with how to rehab someone psychologically as well as obviously dealing with the injury. Yeah. So really, let's go back a little bit. And how did this become your passion then, Carol?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So as many of us, my journey started as an athlete. I played rugby for a long part of my childhood and growing up, and going to university. When I was at university, I was studying and had an interest in psychology, so I started studying that. But I was also taking my rugby quite serious, and experienced along the way a lot of injuries, as many of us did, and still do. But I wanted to find out a little bit more as to what was going on, because I was experiencing a lot of transition and stress at the time, and finding that link between stress and injury a fascinating one. And I wanted to unpick it and understand it. So I retired from playing rugby and just continued down the education path to understand a little bit more of the psychology and the mindset behind athletes, and you know, certain individuals were more prone to injury and how injury came along and how people coped with injury. So that set me on that path and to where I am today, and went through the education system, and then I did a PhD, and that PhD focused more on the management of chronic illness and rehabilitation from chronic illness. And I worked with a lot of transplant recipients that then getting into sport. So then kind of had some experience of what it was like to go through a chronic illness and then navigate that through sport. And it found me where I am now, started developing and running a practice supporting injured athletes, those transitioning from playing to retiring, going through chronic illness, supporting that recovery journey.
Yeah, great. One thing you mentioned there that I want to pick up on and talk a little bit deeper about is stress. So how I'm going to talk about it and how I'm going to kind of relate to it is, instead of someone just twisting their knee on the pitch or on the court or anything like that, how much of a factor does stress building up become a big factor in the fact maybe that's why it happened, because it was stress has a big factor in the twisting the muscle or the twisting the ankle or something like that. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. And what we know from a psychological point of view is stress is the biggest psychological predictor of injury frequency. So as you mentioned, the stress when we're under physical stress obviously has an impact on us in terms of fatigue and overuse injuries and things like that. But from a psychological standpoint, it really is the biggest predictor. And what happens with a lot of individuals is we're faced with a potentially stressful situation. So that might be the demands in sport. It might be things outside of sport, like university degrees, challenges with family situation, whatever it may be. We're faced with a stressful situation. When we do, we think about that situation, and it creates a response, what we call the stress response. Now that stress response is going to determine whether we are going to experience an injury or not in the situation. And that stress response is really basically how we appraise a situation, and what happens to us physically, what changes. So from a physiological point of view, our attention changes. We start getting kind of tunnel vision. And if we appraise a situation as this is the most stressful thing I could ever imagine, then it's going to change us physiologically. When that happens, it's going to increase our risk of experiencing an injury. And that's really because the demands of the stressor placed on us at any moment outweigh what we feel our ability is to cope with it. Does that make sense? So
yeah, so it's like a bit of overwhelm kind of, as well as kind of stress, kind of overwhelming, and something out of the ordinary may happen that's it doesn't usually happen to yourself because of stress, for example.
exactly that. So it's really our ability to how we appraise the situation, how we view the situation, because stress is our perception, and the things that influence it are our ability to cope, so our coping resources. Our personality can also influence our response to stress, and also the fact that we've gone through other stresses. So if we've been subjected to many stresses in our life, we're going to probably have built the coping resources to navigate future stress. So the way in which that interacts is really important when it comes to injury. And it, like I say, it's the most prominent aspect. So anyone listening to this, going through a stressful time, just work on managing those stresses. Find ways in which you can engage in stress management activities to lessen that threat response that you're going to develop, and that's going to reduce your risk of injury. So it's a very good injury prevention technique, in much the same way, I guess, it physiologically or physically, you would manage that load, the training load,
exactly.
you warm up and cool down in the same way to navigate those stresses.
Definitely. So can we go a bit deeper into, obviously, injury psychology and give examples of how it's helped athletes you've worked with before?
Yeah, so one of the biggest areas, I would say, is managing the return from injury. Now, often with a lot of athletes I've worked with, especially serious injuries like ACL injuries, where you have a long time out of sport, or a traumatic injury, individuals seem to develop this fear of returning, this re-injury anxiety, we call it. And that is this heightened sense of fear around the likelihood that they're going to re-injure themselves when they return, because our brains are very astute and clever, and it's going to map onto that time when you injured yourself. So it's going to remember that and send alarm bells to you the next time that you step back on that pitch or on that court. So that fear response is a challenging one to work with, because it often leads to avoidance behaviors. So those avoidance behaviors are sometimes not committing to rehab, or lack of adherence in rehab, or delaying our return to sport. And for some, they never go back because that fear avoidance is too strong there. That's one of the biggest areas we work with. We use psychology to expose athletes to that stressful situation and try and regulate their emotions in ways that calms that fear response down. So that gives them more of a tool set to navigate that situation. So that's one of the most common areas I find myself working in. And then the other one I would say is managing the emotions, and managing the range of emotions through injury can be challenging. And these emotions are likened to the way in which we grieve when we lose someone. We experience this sadness, this anger, this irritation, lack of motivation, all these things swirling around. So just trying to regulate emotions, using psychological support as a way to make room for those emotions and experience them in a safe way has been quite helpful for a lot of athletes. So those may be probably the two biggest areas that I would work in.
So you find that the most kind of common areas that you find with athletes at the moment, then, like when you're training or retraining them or rehabbing them to go back into sport, those two areas.
Yeah, absolutely. It's firstly just dealing with that disruption of injury and what that means. Sometimes that identity loss, the lack of confidence, the decrease in performance, and then that fear and anxiety response when we're returning.
Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into the fear or the avoidance. I mean, let's talk a bit deeper about that. How can we go further into that then, Carl?
Yeah, so the fear of re-injury, or sometimes that fear of pain, can lead to avoidance behaviors. So when someone has had a serious injury, they might become overly cautious about the specific part of their body that's been injured. And over time, that sends signals to the brain that then adapts our behavior. But it adapts it in ways that are sometimes not helpful. So then that can become limiting in terms of ability and our functioning. And it can hinder the rehab program and the ultimate return to sport. So we've got to find ways of firstly identifying that this is maybe a common thing that a lot of athletes experience. And in we can normalize it and accept it, that it's going to be part of it, right? And if we can do that, we can adapt the rehab program to take into consideration that fear response. And I work with a lot of physios to help kind of address when those moments are going to be, or to identify when certain athletes are experiencing that fear avoidance behavior through certain moments of their rehab, and trying to maybe expose them to those real life situations earlier on the rehab program, so that they can get that exposure and know that it's safe to return when we get back. Does that make sense?
So it's kind of like, as you're saying, you're kind of readjusting as such with the athletes to build their confidence up, make them make them back, think clearer and have a better vision for what they're going forward to. Yeah, does that make sense as well? Yeah.
Exactly that. Yeah. So just really trying to help individuals overcome that fear and anxiety related to those physical movements or activities. And like you say, allowing them to gradually rebuild and regain that confidence and mobility. And those two come hand in hand.
So, for example, I was just thinking there when you were saying that about you're taking a racket athlete, for example, that had, I don't know, a fracture on their elbow or something, or something like that. I mean, even getting back to using it, doing a full swing for an athlete of using a lot of speed and power on a court and agility, as you say, working with yourself, you'd be working on things like that. Okay, why do you think you can't? Why do you think you can't do the full power swing now? You've had the rehab on your fracture. It's all healed. So it's something similar to that, right?
Exactly that. And a lot of the time I can work with athletes in that area, no problem. But I really feel that the best opportunity that athletes have is to work with their physio and
Yeah.
their coaches with that, because
Yes.
they're in the room with
In
them
zone.
doing the rehab, so
Yeah.
they can have and reassure athletes
Yeah.
and work on those gradual exposure things to really build in that confidence. I think, yeah, I really want to just enable everyone working with athletes to have that capacity to do that, to support them in that way as well.
Yeah. Okay. So you've obviously spoken about the fear, anxiety. What was the other one you spoke about earlier again?
Just managing the I guess the emotional response and
Yeah, of
the
course. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So emotional response is a little bit deeper, and let's see where we can go with that one, Carol.
yeah. So I guess in terms of emotions, when we first get injured, we experience a range of emotions. And uh, you mentioned earlier the kind of mental or emotional well-being. And injury is a stressor. It's a stressor on the body. It's a stressor emotionally and psychologically.
Yeah.
And we experience different emotions: sadness, isolation, anger. But if left untreated, and in some cases it can lead to depression or
Yeah.
more serious mental health
Yeah, of
challenges.
course. Yeah.
The link between mental health and an injury is also kind of bi-directional. So
Yeah.
poor mental health functioning can increase our chances of injury, but
Yeah.
injury can increase our chances of poor mental health functioning.
Yeah.
So it's just managing and working on supporting that emotional side, especially with conditions like depression or anxiety.
Hmm.
Uh, they can exacerbate pain perception
Yeah.
um, and
Yeah.
can
Yeah.
slow the healing process down, right? So
Yeah.
when we're feeling depressed or anxious, we might be more susceptible to catastrophizing. When we're catastrophizing around pain and injury, it can exacerbate that sense
Hmm.
that we feel in pain, and that
Yeah.
can just delay and slow down that healing process as well.
Yeah. So I think that kind of makes a lot of sense with emotional well-being, emotional response. I think from my experience and a lot of the people I've spoken to, like yourself in psychology, and that it seems to be that if you can kind of regulate your emotions, you're kind of onto a winner, right?
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And regulating our emotions is can be challenging if we're not comfortable expressing or feeling our
Yeah.
emotions.
Hmm.
So having a space to talk it through, and if anyone's listening, going through rehab and kind of feeling those emotions, it's just knowing that then they're not alone in them, that those
Yeah.
emotions can feel like a roller coaster. But if you can find someone to share them with, talk them through, you actually find that they're actually really, really normal
Yeah.
experiences, and we can be okay managing rehab with these emotions coming along the journey with us.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. There's ways we can regulate our emotions if we just first accept that they're part and parcel of
Yeah.
everyday life as human beings.
Yeah. Exactly.
Also, especially through the rehab process, there's a lot of emotions that are going on for us.
Yeah. I think as well, touching on that like a little bit more, emotional well-being is obviously a big thing in mental health, obviously, and psychology and working with sports people.
Mm.
Um, Obviously you do a lot of work with that. Obviously yourself, um, in sort of management of emotion and fear, anxiety, and things like that with your athletes or clients or whatever you want to call them. Sorry. Where can people actually find you and your information and your website and your everything? It's you're kind of you're about.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I would encourage people to go through social media. It seems to be the way in which we find and legitimize people these days. But if you look at the injury psychologist on Instagram, you find links to my webpage and various resources which can be helpful. It's not that you have to come and speak with me or have a session with me. It's just finding platforms and spaces that maybe offer some insight and some emotional support. And injury can be an incredibly isolating experience for
Yeah.
a lot of individuals. So finding and building that support network, whether that's physios, coaches, psychologists, family members, friends, just being involved and having people around you to offer the varying types of support that you're going to need. Because sometimes you might need that emotional support to just bounce off how you're feeling. Sometimes you might need that functional support because you're restricted in your movement and you need someone to, pick you up and drop you off somewhere. So there's different types of support you need throughout that process. So involve yourself, but also find resources online. There's plenty out there. And if you check out my page, there'll be links to other resources that you can probably find as well.
Yeah. One thing I would like to reiterate there as well is what you mentioned is isolation. There's people when people realize they're not alone, they become a bit more open about it, don't they? Because there is a lot of people going through, other people going through this similar ideas and similar things are happening, right?
Yeah, and often as human beings, we when anything happens to us, we think we're the only person that's experienced this,
Yeah.
and we through that sense that cycle of
Mm-hmm.
isolating thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And often, if we can just connect with others and know that there's many other people that have experienced this and gone through this, we can reduce those feelings of isolation.
Yes.
And that will increase our support system, but it also lift our mood and
Mm-hmm.
our emotional well-being at the same time. So, your athletes working with you, others around, just build that network and look for other people that have gone through similar experiences, similar injuries, and use them as a source of support, but also a source of I can get through this, that I've seen what they've done, and that can give people some hope as well.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. One thing I was gonna finish on asking you was, have you written any books or articles or blogs people can get a hold of, and is it all on your website or?
There's a number of I guess articles and blogs that I've written over the years. People can look on my website and find a few, or just Google me. I'm sure there'll be a few popping up to try and populate my website and social media with as many resources as possible. So do check those out. But also, please feel free to reach out, drop me a DM or an email. Happy to direct individuals to resources that are available for free or online, or happy just to connect, because sometimes it's useful just to have a bit more of a network of support around you. So
Yeah,
yeah, offer that. Feel free to get in touch.
yeah.
Happy to
It's
redirect.
it's often that human connection as well can obviously lead to other people might find other connections that may be able to help you in the future, right?
Absolutely. And I just can't shout about social support enough. It's the
Yeah,
biggest buffer to stress and
yeah,
overall well-being. So
yeah,
injury is a
definitely.
stressor. We got to find ways to buffer it. So,
Yeah,
build that network.
yeah. Okay, Carol, that's been great. It's speaking to you today, and we're going to finish it there. It's been great having you on the show, Carol.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's another episode of the Racket Athlete podcast, and we'll speak to you soon, folks.